Welcome to another video in our series of short conversations we're hosting on Biden's supply chain policies and what in-house counsel and compliance personnel should know. I'm Kerry Contini. I'm a partner in Baker McKenzie's international trade practice in DC. And in this video, we are focusing on one of the specific critical supply chains that have really been at the center of the administration's efforts. That's the semiconductor supply chain. I know this is of interest not only to semiconductor manufacturers and suppliers, but also companies in other industries, given how ubiquitous these products are, and they show up in all kinds of different products. For today's conversation, I'm joined by three experts: John McKenzie, a partner in our international trade practice in San Francisco; Alexandra Minkovich, a partner in our tax practice in DC; Callie Lefevre, a senior associate in our trade and foreign investment practice in DC. And John, in particular, has been working so closely with the semiconductor industry for many years. So I will turn things over to John to lead our discussion today.
Thank you, Kerry, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning or this afternoon. It's, of course, no secret that the semiconductor supply chain has been in the news a great deal in really the very recent years, and especially in the past year of the Biden administration. There is, as Kerry indicated, a severe shortage of semiconductor devices, which has broad ripple effects throughout the economy, given the fact, again, as Kerry alluded to, that those devices are utilized in almost everything we deal with, ranging from washing machines to automobiles to supercomputers to our cell phones. In the past year, the Biden administration has been focused on the supply chain in the semiconductor industry and grappling with two, and I think sometimes inconsistent, policy concerns. The first being national security concerns and the dependence of the United States on the manufacturing and supply capabilities of certain countries in Asia, and most particularly in China, for the supply of semiconductor devices. The other being, of course, the shortage and what that means for the economy, as well as uncertainties or potential disruptions in the supply chain. Under the circumstances, in February of last year, so just about a year ago, the administration mandated that the Commerce Department perform studies as to supply chains and supply chain vulnerability in a number of industries, including in the semiconductor industry. In June of last year, the Commerce Department issued its report on semiconductor supply chain, both identifying a series of vulnerabilities and making recommendations as to steps that the government and policymakers should take to provide for a more dependable and more resilient supply chain. A series of incentives are being discussed in the administration and in proposed legislation in the Congress, including incentives to encourage onshoring or reshoring or nearshoring, if you will, of the manufacturing and supply capability in the semiconductor industry. Now, what we'd like to do in the next few moments is talk a little bit about what these policy developments may mean from both a legal and a tax perspective, and what challenges companies are likely to face as they attempt to address the issues of supply chain shortage, as well as perhaps forthcoming legislative developments that will affect how we go about the process of manufacturing and delivering semiconductor devices. As a first step with that, I'd like to turn the program over to Alexandra to give us thoughts from a tax perspective and a tax policy perspective with respect to the semiconductor supply chain. Alexandra?
Thanks, John. From a tax perspective, the semiconductor industry is really in the same position as many other industries, and that is waiting to see whether or not the Senate is going to be able to pass the Build Back Better Act. What's specific to the semiconductor industry is that the Build Back Better Act contains a tax provision, a new investment tax credit that would be specific to investments in facilities to manufacture semiconductors or to manufacture tooling equipment. This is designed to incentivize onshoring or reshoring, as John mentioned a few moments ago. Now, There is some question about whether or not Congress is actually going to be able to enact Build Back Better. They had originally planned to do it in December, and it is now mid-January. This credit, however, that's contained in Build Back Better may have other legislative vehicles that it can be included in, even if Build Back Better is never enacted. The credit was previously included in a bipartisan bill called the FABS Act, which many in the semiconductor industry advocated for. And so I think it's promising that it could be included in some future legislation, even if Build Back Better never passes. Another tax provision that is not specific to semiconductors, but that I think this audience should be aware of, relates to the tax credit for R&D expenses generally. There was a change in the law on January 1st. Prior to January 1st, companies were able to claim an immediate expense deduction for their R&D expenses. The law changed on January 1st, and now companies have to amortize those expenses over a 10-year period if R&D expenses are incurred in the United States, and over 15 years if the R&D expenses are incurred outside the United States. Build Back Better included a provision that would revert to prior law. In other words, allowing taxpayers to take an immediate expense deduction for R&D expenses. The thing that I am most frequently advising tax departments and government affairs departments about is to really focus your lobbying efforts either on your own behalf as an individual company or through the trade organizations of which you're a member to ensure that the new investment tax credit that's specific to semiconductors gets enacted, and to push Congress to revert to prior law to allow for immediate expensing of R&D. And with that, John, I'll turn the discussion back to you.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. I guess we have to talk about both the good news and the bad news, the carrot, if you will, as Alexandra described it in terms of various incentives, and on the other hand, the stick. In that context, I'd like to talk just for a couple moments about the export control issue, which may be looking at certain increased restrictions on the transfers of equipment, technology, and software used in the semiconductor production area, especially transfers to China. In 2018, the Congress passed the so-called Export Control Reform Act, and one of the provisions of that statute directs the Commerce Department to reconsider and perhaps even recontrol certain technologies for exports to countries with which the U.S. has an arms embargo, which is something of a code word in export control speak for China. We've seen either proposals or actions, both during the Trump administration and more recently during the Biden administration, to control or propose new controls on equipment, the tools, if you will, used in the manufacturing and testing of semiconductor equipment, especially exports of those items to China. Various proposals are similarly floating around within the administration that would impose controls on certain categories of semiconductor technology with potential impact on fabless semiconductor companies that may rely upon the foundry capabilities of semiconductor foundries abroad, again, particularly in China. In December, in the last round of so-called Wassenaar multinational discussions, a series of proposals were made and indeed may be implemented, imposing controls on certain categories of EDA software used for the design and development of semiconductor design, circuitry technology, and so forth. And finally, we've seen, again, both during the Trump administration, more recently with the Biden administration, the listing of various Chinese companies, including Chinese semiconductor foundries and OSATs, on the so-called entity list of companies subject to special export control restrictions and licensing, the most prominent of them being Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation, China's largest and most prominent semiconductor foundry. Those proposals and the steps that have actually been taken may make it more difficult for companies to rely upon manufacturing capability in China, and therefore the other side of the story may be what capacity may be available for manufacturing in other parts of the world, the onshoring, nearshoring that Alexandra referred to. Kerry, before we move on, I wonder whether you have any other observations on the export control side.
Thanks, John. I think it's real clear that the administration is going to pursue export controls on more items related to the semiconductor industry. But the only additional point I wanted to make is that whatever efforts the administration takes are sure to have an emphasis on approaching this multilaterally. U.S. industry has repeatedly said that unilateral controls unfairly disadvantage U.S. industry. And in fact, the administration has basically acknowledged that in a lot of statements and made it clear that they are emphasizing taking these controls and proposing them at the multilateral level so that there is a more level playing field.
Thank you, Kerry. And that may be something of a sea change from the prior administration. Another element of this, however, relates to foreign investment by foreign investors in the semiconductor industry in the United States. And the Commerce Department's recommendations recommended or suggested a rigorous policy of foreign investment review by foreign investors acquiring interest in U.S. semiconductor manufacturing and packaging capability. And Callie, let me turn the program over to you for some comments of what you're seeing and what you anticipate as CFIUS looks at this type of foreign investment.
Thanks, John. The Commerce Report said that CFIUS should continue to consider the impact of foreign investment transactions on the semiconductor supply chain. And just to be clear, the basic framework of the U.S. Foreign Investment Review, CFIUS, remains the same. So CFIUS looks at specific foreign investment transactions into U.S. businesses to consider the potential national security impacts of those transactions and has the authority to condition or even block transactions if there are national security risks. The Commerce Report said that CFIUS should continue to consider the impact of foreign investment on the semiconductor supply chain because CFIUS has traditionally considered sourcing and supply chain issues in its assessment of potential vulnerabilities associated with a U.S. business. I think two things are changing really. First, there is a more acute sense of the national security vulnerabilities inherent in the semiconductor supply chain. Obviously, this has been happening over a series of decades, but there is a real sense now that with the decrease in the U.S. global share of production and the increase in how, as Kerry said, ubiquitous semiconductors are in our economy and our daily lives, it's a real national security issue. So from a practical perspective, that means that when CFIUS analyzes national security vulnerabilities associated with a U.S. business, it's going to really look carefully at how supply chain and semiconductor supply chain issues increase those vulnerabilities and create potential risks. And then the other change we're seeing is just a very active CFIUS. So CFIUS has developed a team that reviews not just the transactions that have been proactively notified to the committee, but also transactions that have not been notified. And so we're really feeling CFIUS's activity and its interest in this sector specifically. And I think we can look for two potential developments. John, as you and Kerry talked about, if we see, and we likely will see, increased new and additional export controls on semiconductor-related items, that will have an impact on foreign investment review because the U.S. regulations are tied to the U.S. export controls, and it might result in an increased number of transactions that have a required filing before CFIUS. And then the other thing to consider, as you mentioned, John, is that there is a proposal before Congress for a CFIUS-like review of outbound investment. So investments by U.S. businesses in entities or in countries, in specific countries that might result in a relocation or a transfer of ownership of specific sensitive sectors, which would include the semiconductor industry.
Thank you, Callie. And just as we conclude this program, I'd like to ask each of Alexandra and Kerry and Callie to comment. If there is one thing that someone who is a general counsel of a company that either produces or acquires or relies upon semiconductors, what are the one or two things, takeaways, that the general counsel should have in mind? So, Alexandra, maybe you can give us a couple of bullets and we'll move around the team.
Absolutely. Stay engaged with Congress on this new investment tax credit. I think that the Biden administration really views that as an important tool to increase semiconductor production in the United States.
Kerry, from an export control perspective, one or two bullets that you would see as a takeaway that our hypothetical general counsel should be thinking about.
Expect more controls, but expect there to be a lot of outreach to industry and opportunity for industry input, and expect this all to take potentially some time at the multilateral level.
Thank you. And Callie, from a foreign investment perspective, if we're looking down the road, what should the general counsel be thinking about from a foreign investment perspective?
I would say, in addition to technical compliance with the regulations in the context of M&A transactions, GCs of semiconductor companies or companies that are up or downstream should just recognize the sensitive geopolitical context that they're operating in and will continue to be operating in likely. And there will be opportunities to engage, I would say, with Congress over the next couple of years as these rules and especially the potential offshoring rules develop.
Okay, well, thank you, Alexandra, Kerry, and Callie for your comments on that. And now, Kerry, let me turn the program back to you for a concluding remark.
I just wanted to thank everybody for joining. These conversations always give me a lot of food for thought, and I hope the same for you. We're always happy to discuss these issues with you further. And I would encourage anyone who's listening to check out the other videos in this series. Some of these will cover or have already covered the Biden administration's efforts related to other critical supply chains like high capacity batteries, critical minerals and strategic materials, or pharma and API. We look forward to seeing you soon.